When he mentioned his topic idea to me earlier in the year, I thought, what a great topic for Thacher. It's really interesting to see where this goes. Boarding schools and country clubs share some things in common. Super hard to get into, expensive. They make you dress up sometimes for dinner, golf carts. Beyond that, my knowledge is sketchy, but Toto's is not. And we all know a little bit more about boarding school, but after today we'll know a lot more about country clubs. And it's been interesting to watch his research develop over the course of the year. He's looked a lot at the history and the social pressures that country clubs have faced and done some thinking about where they may be headed. So I'm looking forward to hearing about that, and I hope you are too. So without any further ado, here's Toto.
So first, I'd like to start with a quote from The Theory of the Leisure Class by Thorstein Ludwig. In order to gain and to hold the esteem of men, it is not sufficient merely to possess wealth or power. The wealth or power must be put in evidence, for esteem is awarded only in evidence. People naturally associate themselves with people that have similar backgrounds, perhaps race, gender, religion, or socioeconomic status. Some examples of these groupings might be church groups, neighborhood groups, parenting groups, etc. While country clubs naturally cater to an exclusionary environment that many people feel reflect the poorest values of this country. Studying their history is also simply another way of looking at how people interact with one another based on the traits that I just mentioned. In my presentation, I will explore the history of the club and the values that it was built off of, the legal and social resistance and discourse that these clubs have faced throughout the 20th century, and conclude with the current state of the private club and how I feel they will progress and what they will offer in the future. So the start of the unofficial club. So the first clubs founded in America were not official. They mainly consisted of dining clubs, and they were collective places for city leisure among wealthy American men. And it was essentially a group of men that rotated between houses, and they were very informal. We saw the first dining club in 1700 in Maryland, and after the American Revolution, elites in Richmond, Virginia, organized the Barbecue Club with Justice John Marshall as its leader, which started the political affiliation with these clubs and also led to a more structured club. So next came the Tavern Club, which consists of the Green Dragon and the Bunch of Grapes in Boston, as shown here, Little's Tavern in New York City, and Lebanon in Philadelphia. They similarly served elite men in society. And some of these tavern groups rotated between people's houses similar to dining clubs, and they were very exclusive to be a part of. They did have a stricter membership policy, as you need a unanimous vote from the club to be a part of it. And these groups felt the need to separate themselves from outside society, and this progressed into a more formal club setting, and this is when we saw the start of the official private club. So the first clubs fashioned themselves after British clubs and were in the largest northeastern cities with the exception of San Francisco. We saw the Temple Club in Boston, founded in 1829, the Philadelphia Club, founded in 1834, the Union Club in New York, founded in 1836, the Pacific Union Club, founded in San Francisco in 1852. It wasn't adopted in the South until later because the plantation culture dominated the Southern gentleman's life. And the private club was the modern practice of elitism at the time, as the Civil War era brought an end to many previous traditional elite practices and ushered in the private club. And many of these members started to create constitutions to regulate how these clubs were run, and they looked towards these British clubs as examples. This leads into the initial culture of the private club. So a great deal of these clubs adopted their membership practices and ideas from the British clubs. They were a replacement for the elite plantation atmosphere, and they catered for this natural want to associate with people of similar background. And what this led to was a variety of people discriminating against one another for certain reasons, such as past history, ethnicity, heritage, gender, and etc. It mainly led to people forming clubs to satisfy their wants for a certain subset of members. And this led to an influx in all Jewish clubs, all African American clubs, and even all women's clubs at the turn of the 19th century. Examples being, in 1887, we saw the Athenaeum Club in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which was the first clubhouse strictly for women. We saw the Covenant Club, a well-known all-Jewish club founded in 1916, which was well-known for discriminating against Protestant and Catholic members. So as society progressed during this time, there have been extreme advancements in technology that allow for people to live further away from these large cities. Americans, at the turn of the century, sought out a life of leisure. And this began with summer resorts and sports that drew these clubs away from the city. Elites also wanted to escape these high costs and undesirable aspects of the city, and the suburbs offered a permanent solution. People searched for clubs to show wealth, as well as seeking leisure time through events such as yachting, horse racing, and tennis. But elites still searched for this combination of resort, sport, and suburb. And this led to the creation of the country club, because it offered the perfect combination of leisure, sports. It was a perfect thing for the suburbs since it required a large landscape. And it was expensive, and as a result, people of the highest classes of society were only able to play the sport. So the values associated with these clubs was there was a natural exclusivity, as there was a geographical and social barrier that set these new clubs apart from the lowest classes of society, and it was in a location that only the wealthy could afford. They adopted their membership practices from British clubs and highly regarded private clubs in America. And this consisted of them not allowing women, minorities, or Jewish people, since they all had negative societal connotations at the time. And these clubs strived for their social image and would not risk lowering this social image by accepting these types of members. So in 1890, we saw Ridgewood Country Club, which was the first club to adopt golf. But golf had become a developing sport throughout this time period, especially between 1885 and 1900. And during this time, there was over 1,000 golf courses built, mostly surrounding the largest cities in this country. And playing golf on Sundays also started during this time in the late 1890s, and this received a large amount of opposition from the religious community. Also at this time, businesses did not operate on Sundays, which made golf courses operating on Sundays a violation of blue laws. And blue laws, also known as Sunday laws, are laws designed to restrict or ban some or all Sunday activities for religious reasons, particularly to promote observance of a day of worship or rest. And of course, country clubs challenged this rule, and they won. And after they challenged the rule, they received a large amount of petitions from the religious community to try and deter these clubs from operating on Sunday. Yet these clubs continued to ignore these criticisms, and they embraced or rejected traditions as it suited their needs. As Henry James expressed in the quote over there, in the American scene, in reference to the importance of the country club, quote, "The country club is everywhere a clear American felicity, a complete product of the social air and soil which alone have made it possible. It becomes, for the restless analyst, one of the great garden lamps in which the flame of democracy burns whitest and steadiest and most floods the subject, taking its place thus on the positive side of a line, which had its other side overscored with negatives." So the purpose of these clubs at the time was belonging to the right club conveyed a measure of prestige and status for members. It allowed entry to the most powerful and connected groups in a community, which was great for networking in the business world. And just as important, country clubs remained a comfy retreat from the day's pressure, a place to meet friends or enjoy a superior meal. And clubs also offered exclusivity, dress codes, and more often than not, an old world ambience that people loved. And these clubs were also used in order to move up and gain social capital, or possibly become rejected and become devalued, not only in the eyes of the club, but in the community at large. So at the turn of the century, clubs faced economic problems as a result of the passing of the 16th Amendment in 1913, which allowed for the government to tax personal income. This made American elites more conscious about spending their money and began to be a part of less clubs. And private clubs in general reached a peak before World War I, but began to decline with the war, and only the most prestigious clubs were able to survive after the Great Depression. But after the Great Depression, there wasn't any societal pressures that forced these clubs to change until the Civil Rights era. And as society progressed with the Civil Rights movement, these clubs faced legal and social challenges, such as Hudson v. Charlotte Country Club, Burning Tree Country Club versus Maryland, Augusta National Golf Club versus the National Council of Women's Organizations, Shoal Creek Country Club, and Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor. So first I'd like to lay the case of Hudson v. Charlotte Country Club. In 1982, Hudson, an employee that was fired from this club, sued under violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And in his situation, the courts felt that they lacked jurisdiction. And this was because clubs are defined as a bona fide private membership club and therefore exempt from Title VII. Hudson also appealed to a federal court under violation of Section 1981 of Title 42 of the United States Code, which does not have an exemption for country clubs similar to Title VII. And the court found that if this club was exempt from the requirements of Title VII, it was also exempt from Section 1981. I will get into exactly what this section entails later, but this decision is divided amongst the courts, as some feel this Title VII supersedes Section 1981, while others believe that Section 1981 is separate from Title VII. So next, I'd like to look at Burning Tree Country Club versus Maryland. In 1983, only a year later, Attorney General Stephen H. Sachs of Maryland filed a lawsuit against the Burning Tree Country Club, the Washington area's most prestigious country club, charging that its policies of excluding women are, quote, arbitrary, invidious, and irrational, and in violation of state constitution. Burning Tree, the 600-member club regarded as the club of the presidents, has allowed no woman as member, employee, or guest to come onto the club's grounds in the 60 years of its existence. The suit asked the Montgomery County Circuit Court to revoke the real estate abatement granted in return for the club's preservation of open space, which is the 18 holes of golf. In effect, the state's complaint said the tax exemption made the party subject to sex discrimination in violation of law. And this tax would cost the club over $1 million if the club would not change their ways and paid the tax instead of allowing women members. So as shown above, in these clubs are exempt from legislation associated with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, especially in relation to Title II and Title VII. Also, depending on the courts, this also exempts these clubs from Section 1981 of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which also bars employment discrimination. And the reason for this is that these clubs qualify under the tax exemption of U.S. Code 26, Section 501, which defines the club as private and makes it so they are not subject to civil rights legislation. And this goes off the basis of freedom of association guaranteed by the First Amendment and the right to privacy guaranteed by the Fourth Amendment. Although in 1983, the American Bar Association recommended that, quote, private clubs be reclassified as public accommodations if they receive a substantial portion of their income from business sources. This recommendation, even though it did not lead into anything, was recognition that these clubs should not be as legally exempt as they are. And both clubs used these legal freedoms and were able to maintain these traditional membership practices and values as a result. And next I want to focus more on the social side of the thing. And first I'd like to address Augusta National Golf Club versus the National Council of Women's Organizations. So in 2003, Martha Burke, the woman on the left, chairman of this National Council of Women's Organizations, sent a letter to chairman of Augusta National, William Johnson, urging him to invite women to join. Johnson responded, commenting that Augusta was a private club, and they would not be bullied. He even said, quote, "There may well come a day when women will be invited to join our membership, but that timetable will be ours, and not at the point of a bayonet," referring to Martha Burke's letter. And some believe that Augusta had been on the verge of admitting women before abruptly changing course when Burke's letter arrived. And this was because over the last 13 years after this incident, the club has accepted 3 women members: Condoleezza Rice, former U.S. Secretary of State; Virginia Rometty, CEO of IBM; and Darla Moore, a partner of a private investment firm, Rainwater Incorporated. But after this confrontation, Burke contacted the Masters' 3 top advisors for their tournament: Coca-Cola, IBM, and Citigroup. And after she did this, Johnson unexpectedly announced that the tournament that year would be broadcast commercial free. That meant that Augusta would lose up to $7 million in endorsements. And this only further shows that this club was not controlled by any outside pressure, especially money. And this just goes off their basic principle of the club. And Burke, however, is not likely to drop the issue. Finished with a comment, quote, "It's not a legal battle, it's a moral one. Yes, they, Augusta National, have a legal right to do it, but they have a moral imperative to do better." So next I'd like to look at Shoal Creek Country Club. In 1990, Shoal Creek Country Club near Birmingham, Alabama, gave an African American man an honorary membership as part of an agreement to head off protests by civil rights groups at the PGA Championship. After that, clubs across the country began to admit black members. This was because they wanted to avoid the poor publicity, and this also reinforces that one country club can have a huge effect on country clubs across the country. So next I'd like to look at Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor. So when she was a nominee, she was forced to part ways with her all-women's social club in 2009, the Belizean Grove in New York. This was because she faced criticism about belonging to an organization that has no male members. And this is an interesting example, as this case deals with an all-women's club, but sets an example that society doesn't appreciate discrimination in any form. And it's an important example because it shows people going after influential members of these clubs. And these clubs put a grave importance on their members because it can have a large effect on their societal image. So as shown above, most of these clubs cannot weather social pressures, such as Augusta did with Martha Burke. And these clubs cannot handle this poor publicity. And this is just a strong example of how certain social pressures can lead to a great deal of change in membership practices of clubs across the country. So where are these clubs headed? What I've told you today leads you to believe that these clubs are legally exempt and are able to discriminate freely and maintain the core values of their club. The social pressures may lead to a token member in most clubs will not truly inspire change, since they don't have to publicly express their membership practices or the members of their club. And this is where state legislation comes into play. States have begun to play a large role in changing the core values of these clubs through exposing their membership practices. And they do this by creating legislation that defines these clubs as a public institution instead of a private one. And this is huge because it opens these clubs to legal prosecution that they were previously exempt from. Examples of this being the California Unruh Act that essentially defines if a club is large enough and opens its doors to public organizations such as fundraising or non-club events, they are a public institution and are not allowed to have any discriminatory membership practices. And in Connecticut, their legislation enacted an equal access law that prevents a private country club with at least 20 members and 9 holes of golf, and in which either financially profits from non-members or holds a liquor license from discriminating in its membership or access policies. And what this shows is that states can be progressive and inspiring considerable change in these clubs. And also that there has been the start of these clubs transitioning from their outdated ways. So on the topic of moving away from the old style, it was made apparent that these clubs are starting to transition from this traditional style when you analyze certain clubs across the country. First, I'd like to look at the Olympic Club in San Francisco. The Olympic Club was a club founded in 1860 that has both an athletic and golf component. And it started like a traditional club, not allowing women members and having discrimination in their membership practices against minorities and Jewish people until around the Vietnam War. After the Vietnam War and during the Civil Rights era, there was a low resistance to change their membership practices. They felt that discriminating against certain athletes did a disservice to the club because some of the greatest athletes in the area were people of color. Also, they wanted to avoid legal ramifications as a result of the Unruh Act, which I described earlier. They also began to allow women members when Title IX was introduced. And this was more of a socially motivated change, as the club felt that with the introduction of Title IX, society would not be as accepting of exclusionary practices against women. And since then, the club has been proactive about accepting women members, but also reflecting the demographic of people that live in the San Francisco area, as they want to cater to the community around them. They also have a strong junior program at the club, which is cheap and easily accessible by anyone outside of the club. In interviewing a longtime member, he expressed the importance that the club has put on supporting the surrounding community. They have coaches and teachers available for students after school if they choose to come up to the club. They open their gym to all students on certain days in the San Francisco area, even if they have no affiliation to the club. They also endorse athletics in the community around them with grants and funds. He also said that this atmosphere that the club has created has very much changed the core values of the club, and the club has transitioned into a much more family and communal-based setting. So next I'd like to look at the Union Club. The Union Club was founded in 1836 and is a private club that does not have a golf component to it. Similarly, it began like any other club with similar membership practices to reflect this. One of the founders was even quoted saying, quote, "If the Union Club can be brought up like any English club, it may succeed," only further expressing this want for an exclusionary atmosphere. And this has caused it to become one of the most prestigious clubs in New York at the time. And during the late 19th century and early 20th, they were well known for blackballing members. And if a member was blackballed from this club, it would limit his and his family's rank in society and ability to move up in society. They would be more likely to be denied from other clubs and not invited to high-class social events. So a little bit of a fun fact was that during the time, the New York Times had a special daily section that announced who had been blackballed or dismissed from this club and other clubs in the area. And this further shows the willingness of this club and the clubs in the area to show its high social stature, even if it comes at the expense of people trying to become members. And they were able to maintain these membership practices and this social image until around the 1970s. And during this time, they realized the club needed a stronger representation of young members because the club at the time, all elderly white gentlemen, was not very appealing to a young man. And for this reason, they began to accept women members. And with this decision came a huge influx of young members. So during my interview with a Union Club member, he expressed it wasn't around the early 1990s that the club began to accept African American members. The motivation to make this change was a result of the members feeling it was time to make a change. It could have been a result of the Shoal Creek case, as I shared earlier, but I feel the surrounding community created an environment around this club that did not cater for their exclusive practices, and that many members agreed that the club should make this change. He also shared that once the club decided to move away from their exclusive membership practices, the general atmosphere of the club changed. And what this general atmosphere inspired was a more communal and family-based setting. So next I want to look at the Huntington Country Club. This is a club founded in 1910 on Long Island that's not well known, but its founders certainly are. The founders consisted of Vanderbilts, Tiffany's, Roosevelts, Marshall Fields, etc. All people well known in society at the time and in society today. And this just goes to show that this club was built on an elitist mentality with exclusionary practices similar to most clubs, even though not well known as a prestigious club or for its societal standing. And it was not exclusionary to the extent of these other clubs, but still prevalent when looking at the beginning of the club. And in an interview with my grandfather, a member of the club since the 1970s, and yes, this is my family's country club, he expressed that at this time, there was a large family and communal aspect to the club. And this was because the family of any male member could go use the club, but not the course, whenever they wanted. And this was how the club was able to maintain this style of membership practices and discriminatory practices until the late 1990s and early 2000s. It wasn't until the conflict with Augusta National and Martha Burke, which I addressed earlier, that the club felt the need to make the change. And this wasn't the result of any direct external pressures, but just the general societal mentality towards these practices, as I expressed in the issue with Augusta National. And this club has always catered towards a family atmosphere, but this has become especially prevalent in the recent past. The club has put on family events, especially events catered for children, and encouraged these kids to come up to the club and take lessons and play on the course. In talking with my dad on the issue, he expressed that this was a huge change since he was a kid way back in the 70s and 80s. He said there was always a communal setting, but kids were never as widely accepted as they are now. So what did these clubs show? These clubs further expressed that clubs as a whole are further transitioning from their traditional values and discriminatory practices. These clubs also show that Augusta National, which is how society most associates with the current state of the private club, does not accurately reflect private clubs everywhere. These clubs also show that the culture associated with them are directly related to the generational values of the members that are a part of these clubs. As these clubs are adopting more and more members of this current generation, they are moving away from the values associated with this baby boomer generation. So this baby boomer generation that occupied a huge portion of these clubs over the last 30 years grew up in a time where your social life and family were separate. There were strict social guidelines that people followed, and one of them was not mixing family in these private clubs. And this was evident in talking to my grandfather, who expressed this way of life. He even stated it wasn't different or extreme, it was how families operated during this time. But this baby boomer generation mentality is being completely polarized by this new generation that are starting to carry completely different values. And this new generation being the people that were born after this baby boomer generation and that were not raised with the same traditional values. And this new generation expressed the importance of family and a strong community atmosphere. And this was shown in the 3 clubs I looked at earlier. And what results is a club that caters for families with events and youth activities and having a more inclusive environment in order to allow the club to reflect the community around them. And this new generation is definitely causing these clubs to completely change the social atmosphere and as a result, the culture of these clubs in order to cater for this high importance on family. So my perspective, the fact of the matter is that country clubs will be around because they express the fundamental rights guaranteed by the First and Fourth Amendments. But in the recent years, private clubs have shown a promising future. These recent years have shown that this upcoming generation, the people that will become members of these clubs, have a huge effect on the culture and atmosphere of these clubs. State and federal legislation can, and in the future most likely will, outlaw exclusionary membership practices, but it is up to this new generation to truly change the core values of these clubs. I hope that the audience leaves today with this understanding that this new generation has been given this opportunity to create true change in one of the largest and longest standing social institutions in order to transform these clubs into a healthy communal setting that can be enjoyed by all. Thank you. So, questions? Oh, actually, first of all, I'd like to thank my research advisor, Mr. Land, my presentation advisor, Ms. Livermore, and my group coordinator who's not here right now, but Ms. Perry as well. And, of course, unsung hero, Toby Boyanola. So, any questions? Yes, Cole.
Alright, so I know during your research you drew a lot of comparisons between the Thacher community and various country club communities. Given that you've now completed your Senior X, what would you say is the biggest thing that Thacher could learn from country clubs?
I don't know if I want to answer that.
He hasn't graduated yet.
Yeah. I might address that after graduation, but what they could take away, I don't really know. Like, there are some differences, but I don't think Thacher should look towards country clubs as like advisement for anything they do at the school. Like, of course there are comparisons that can be drawn, but I wouldn't go to the extent that they should learn from country clubs. Yes, Ms. Lee.
So you talked a lot about this movement towards a more welcoming family setting at country clubs, but it seems to me that there still might be some economic barriers for country clubs to actually reflect a true socioeconomic range of our country. So I'm wondering if your research took you at all into what kinds of economic factors come into play for families or people who want to join a club that has a level of exclusivity. What's the range of costs for membership fees? And what are clubs doing to contemplate making it more accessible on a socioeconomic level?
Okay. Three-part question. Okay, first part is kind of when country clubs were built, like kind of the country club was built, then naturally a community was built around it. And so what happened was the high property value of these houses in the community around it kind of made it so that it was expected that the people that were living in these neighborhoods could afford the club. But yes, there's going to be always this natural exclusivity on the basis of finances and economics, because not everyone can afford a certain club's membership fees. But what you see, like start to cater, like the Olympic Club does this, is where they vary their membership costs by age. So people that are youth members pay maybe $250 a year, and then it moves up to maybe, I think $250 a month possibly, or a year, I'm not entirely sure on the numbers, but then as you progress, after 35 you have to pay, I think, $20,000 a year, and then after like 50 you have to pay an even higher amount. What this kind of does is it kind of allows for a wider spectrum of members, because more people can afford like kind of the cheaper membership costs. And what was the last question?
Do you think that given those factors you just talked about, even in that example where there's like a sliding scale idea, that a country club can actually ever truly reflect the socioeconomic diversity that it sits in the middle of?
Yeah, I think that's troubling because it's a private institution, so it means they have to be financially self-sufficient, which means they're going to look towards their membership costs and fees to kind of supply the club and kind of keep it running. So I think there's always going to be that natural exclusivity based on the basis of socioeconomics, which is troublesome, but it's just a matter of fact. It's just what happens. And it's not like they're going to be coming out with these huge endowments trying to cater for financial aid in order to, but I just see that that's always going to be there because it's just how the clubs operate. Yes.
So, in the not too distant future, our country whites will constitute the minority, and so I'm wondering if you think that other racial ethnic groups, non-white, will the current private clubs, country clubs, change to admit these individuals, will non-whites form their own clubs? Or do you think that the private club, country club, is sort of an outmoded social institution that will no longer be relevant as our country becomes more richly diverse?
Well, I feel that like the clubs, as they're starting to progress, will definitely have a wider spectrum of members. But the clubs that have already been previously established, that are well known for being all Jewish and all women, are definitely continue to maintain these practices, just because it's kind of how they've always operated. But I don't see that changing, really. I see that there's always going to be people naturally wanting to associate with people similar. And also kind of communities in this country were kind of congregated based on certain traits like religion. So when you kind of built a club in a certain community, you're naturally catering for the values of the community. So I don't know if that answers your question or not. But I tried. Yes.
Based on the water situation with the West Coast and Arizona, did your research show a big decline in clubs that exist, or that will just, because young people have so many diverse things they can do now, that there's a decline happening within people not only joining clubs, but new clubs going up and existing clubs actually going away because of those factors of the younger generation?
I feel like people enjoy like the clubs not just for the golf atmosphere, but also for the social atmosphere. So I feel like clubs that are already established and have been pretty long-standing are going to continue to be. But there's definitely been a progression of people moving away from the sport of golf in general during the past 10 years. And this is because the attention span of this generation does not cater for 4 hours of golf. But I didn't, in my research, I didn't see kind of a relation between the drought and like the clubs and how it affected these clubs. Because water costs aren't really going to be that much of a deterrent to keep these clubs running during this time. Yes.
I understand that golf is on the decline, and there's been some other uses for courses like soccer, golf, and frisbee golf. What do you think will be the future of what kind of sports will be in the future country club?
Well, they just need to make the sport easier. It's too hard. It's not a sport that you pick up. Like people say, easy to learn, hard to master. It's hard to learn, hard to master. And you don't get instant satisfaction in playing golf. So people are starting to move away. And kind of with soccer golf, it adds more of an athletic component, so you're definitely moving around more. I don't think they're gonna like completely take over golf itself. I think there's still gonna be a strong component that still keeps golf courses around. Yes.
Do you think Augusta letting Condoleezza Rice show that it was moving in the right direction, or actually is evidence that they are in fact discriminatory? Because I don't think many, I would wonder how many white men there graduated from college at 18, like Condoleezza Rice, and accomplished as much as she did. So I wonder if that makes one thing. To be a woman, or a black woman, you have to be a superwoman in order to get in.
Yeah, it definitely brings up this topic of a token member. But I kind of use it as an example to show that Augusta was on the verge of accepting women members, but they definitely do not cater to that environment. And it kind of goes off tradition as well too, because as I mentioned, one of the other women members that they accepted, I think it was Rometti, was a CEO of IBM. And she was accepted as a member just off of the tradition of the club. As the CEO of IBM, he always offered a membership to the club. So I think they definitely still have those exclusive membership practices, and you do definitely have to be women in high society in order to become a part of that club, whether you have a political affiliation or a business world affiliation as well. But Augusta kind of prides itself on its business, like corporate connections, more than like the members itself. And I feel like there's probably a general mentality that we should accept women members of this stature to the club, as it does, as it definitely would deter women, like organizations like Martha Bergman or National Council of Women's Organization from going after the club as well. I don't think it expresses that they've changed the true core values of their membership practices. Yes.
In your research, did you find that all Jewish clubs or all women clubs also face reacted to the same societal pressures to cater to a larger or accept a larger group of members as all white, all male clubs did?
No, they definitely did not receive as much resistance as those clubs did. But you did kind of recently with the case of Sonia Sotomayor back in 2009, it just kind of shows them going after one of the members because she was in she was publicly a high regarded official since she was about to become a Supreme Court justice. And I think that's just an exemption to the rule, and I feel that clubs that are all women and all Jewish and all African American aren't facing resistances like these all male, all white clubs. And I think this just kind of goes off the people looking back to the start of this country, and the start of this country being all white, all male, and they kind of want to move away from this. They kind of like the idea of bringing in these all Jewish clubs and all African American clubs, because it allows for people that normally wouldn't be a part of clubs to be a part of clubs. No more questions? Thank you.